So, James, we've both talked about our radicalization journeys on this podcast, and I think a key point of that is that we both grew up more or less in an age where it felt like progress was just inevitable, right? So,
Mm.
when I was a child, I could look up into the night sky from my bed at my grandparents' house in Sutton, through the window, obviously, like they did have a roof and everything, and I could see Concorde, a supersonic jet, flying overhead, streaking across the sky. And then they were building like a tunnel under the English Channel or the French Channel if you're French to like connect us to the continent and have high speed trains running through it for the first time. And we weren't even worried about Napoleon invading. And then, we had Tim Berners-Lee invent the internet, which in hindsight feels like a bit of a mistake, but it was an incredible age, James.
Martin, I didn't realize we were doing like nostalgia content for millennials. I feel like I should be looking at a Facebook meme. Oh yeah, we used to go out on our bikes and we used to text each other on our Nokia 3310s and then buy some top-up credit from a shop and have to type it in to a text message or whatever, how else you did it. Yeah, but no, I agree. It was a slightly different time. The progress was visible. I think the most visible sign of progress back then was video games. At the start of the 90s, you had your 16-bit era where games looked like shit. And then by the end of the 2000s, you had the PS2, I think, by that point, or we were on the cusp of the PS2. And I remember seeing screenshots from Tekken Tag Tournament, one of the launch games, thinking, my God, this is photorealistic. There is no way graphics can get better than this. But since then, 3D graphics have just got slightly better. Compare a PS5 to a PS4, basically indistinguishable. So yeah, the sense of progress does not feel as palpable.
Yeah, and inevitably James has brought it back to computer games, but back in the real world, I mean, it's not like there weren't serious problems in the 80s and 90s. There was the whole, Cold War thing and miners going on strike and all that kind of stuff. Britain fell out of the exchange rate mechanism, whatever that was, in 1992. But it still generally felt like science and technology and engineering were all moving relentlessly forwards and making people richer, wealthier, generally making the world a more better and exciting place. And I think it's fair to say that there has been just a tiny bit of a vibe shift in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I'd even say a bit more recent than just our entire lifetimes, because I'm a technology journalist, or I have been over my career. And when I first started, it was that sort of just immediate sort of post iPhone years when new things were exciting. We had these amazing new gadgets in our pockets. We had things like Facebook and YouTube and all these new platforms, which were very exciting and allowing us to do new things. And then, Brexit, Trump, Elon Musk, and suddenly there was that vibe shift. The high status opinion became to be sort of, you've got to be cynical and disgusted with technology and big tech and the tech bros. We had to think AI is either going to be just a big nothing burger or it was going to destroy the world. It had to be one or the other. And, people would go, oh, self-driving cars, it'll never work. Oh, look at all these big promises. And we're just seeing nothing happen. It's just all hype and nonsense.
Yeah, and I mean, in fairness, they've got a point. I think a lot of technology in the last 10 years or so isn't really as good as it used to be, like whether it's cars or, the internet in general, the fact that everything's plastered in cookie warnings. Cookies used to be something we loved when we were children, and now they're just a plague on the internet. But so anyway, while you were sunning yourself on your recent holiday, James, the Campaign for Science and Engineering, friends of the pod, I think we can say, have released a major new study on public attitudes to R&D, research and development. And I'm just going to go straight in here and start with the statistic that 40% of the public, James, have never heard of R&D and have basically no idea what it is.
I mean, that's sort of shocking, but I'm not going to shame the general public here, Martin, because I know that in their hearts, the general public are kind, decent people, and they basically know fuck all about all sorts of things, not just science and engineering.
Yeah, I mean, and in fairness, I'm being a little bit cheeky here. So once the survey explains that R&D stands for research and development, that actually rose quite significantly to sort of 80% or so. But I love that as just a great lesson in the fact that even if you're using familiar jargon, it's still quite jargony and it still loses a surprisingly large percentage of people when you're talking about a topic. But yeah, amazingly for people with a university degree, still a third of those didn't actually know what R&D stood for, which is a little bit like if you worked in a container port and you didn't know what a TEU is. But anyway, moving on from niche content for our nerdier viewers. Uh,
One day, Martin, we're going to do a special on containers because I think we both love container
Oh,
ports. But I am going to defend the humanities graduates here, Martin, because, we may not be contributing anything of value to society. But if you need to know what the dagger in Macbeth is a big metaphor for, then you're going to come crawling back to us and wishing you'd not treated us with this sort of disrespect.
I mean, aren't all swords in historical fiction something to do with the penis, James? But I mean, whatever. That's for the literature people to try and figure out. But moving back to the comfortable world of science and engineering, so Case are developing, in my opinion, a bit of a reputation for publishing somewhat surprising research on public attitudes that, in my opinion, don't get quite as much media attention as they deserve, particularly when it comes to the rise of the populist rights, reform, and kind of what's going on that end of the political spectrum. They did some really interesting work earlier this year, which Alicia Grated came on the show and talked about several weeks ago, which found, for example, that reform voters are much more positive about skilled immigration than a lot of people would assume. There's obviously that kind of caricature that basically it's all kind of send them back and kick them over the channel. And actually, a lot of reform voters are quite welcoming to the idea of people coming in from other countries and contributing to R&D and science and technology in the UK, which kind of makes sense. And basically, the more that you look at this stuff, the more you kind of realize that the way these topics are talked about in Westminster and in the media extension of Westminster is incredibly two-dimensional, and it relies on an almost cartoonishly simple image of what the public actually think and feel about any given topic.
Yeah, I agree with you. It drives me a bit crazy, the sort of immigration debate. Obviously, I'm not a massive fan of all of the being horrible to migrant stuff the government are doing at the moment, but it just seems so strange because you get there's obviously a political reason why the government want, for example, the net migration figures to be going down so they can point at a number and say, look at this number, it's falling, but it's so self-defeating. And I think people can obviously see that when you're saying to high-skilled postgraduates who have come here, trained here at our universities, and then saying, now get back to your own country and go and earn loads of money and use all your skills there. We should be trying to keep people like that here, but that requires a sort of more nuanced view of immigration and and the rules around it.
Yeah, and I mean, even at the macro level, the big numbers have gone down massively since Labour have been in power. And, I remember talking to a reform curious friend of a friend who basically just didn't accept that number was true. And so at some point it's like, great, you're working really hard to make this number go down. Nobody actually cares. And the stuff that people do care about, you're sabotaging as well. So, bravo, keep up the good work. But coming back to the latest study, so Case have surveyed 8,000 adults across Britain. And the kind of headline picture of this is that we're basically becoming a nation of withdrawn pessimists, hiding behind our curtains in darkened rooms, a bit like me now trying to make this podcast at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. So the public think that Britain is in decline. They actually say that we need to protect our minorities, but they think we have too many of our own problems to be wasting effort helping other countries and populations around the world or dealing with global issues. Only about 38% of people who are the sort of hardcore optimists think that things can get better in the UK. It's fair to say I think we've moved on from the halcyon days of 1997, James, and over half of people feel that technology is moving too fast, that actually it's causing more problems than it's solving.
That's so depressing, Martin. I mean, people say they like our podcast because we're a bit optimistic, so I worry now that we're going to just make everyone miserable. But does this mean that people are sort of skeptical about research and development as well? Because surely they still think that's a good thing.
So not yet, but I think what's interesting is that all these other sort of numbers that Case are coming up with are kind of like the canary in the coal mine, because while the public haven't fallen out of love with research yet, the results paint a picture of a public that increasingly doesn't really know what research is happening in the UK. They're very out of touch with who actually does research, like what is a researcher, where is research taking place, and they feel very disconnected from the results of it. So they understand in an abstract sense that doing research can be a good thing and it can provide benefits and improve people's lives. But if they look around them at the places where they live and their own lives, they actually struggle to identify any way that this kind of progress or research is making their lives any better. And that's something that's really, really important if you care about Britain remaining a world leader in R&D and being a prosperous high-tech nature in the future, because if the public doesn't believe in science and research, then the political support for spending money on those things starts to dissipate, and even the kind of belief in the results that they're producing, as we've seen in America, for example, with vaccine science.
So, Martin, break it down for me. So, what do the public actually think a researcher is? Should we see more lab coats on our high streets? Would that change people's minds?
Yeah, so maybe let's step back a bit. So are you
Hmm.
familiar with the Robin Williams sitcom Mork and Mindy, James?
Amazingly, I am. I've never actually seen it, but I do remember there used to be trailers for it on the Paramount Comedy Channel, because after Nickelodeon closed down at 7 p.m., they'd switch over to Paramount. My parents didn't have Paramount. It just switched off, but they always got the first 2 minutes with trailers, and Mork and Mindy was on there. So the one thing I know is Robin Williams is an alien in the show, and also that weirdly it's a spin-off of Happy Days.
Yeah, apparently they could either go with the alien or the shark, and they chose the alien. It was just easier to put on TV screens. Very niche TV tropes joke for the keen listener there.
Actually, one other thing about Mork and Mindy, and I do want to throw this in just because I find this absolutely maddening, and I feel it's the sort of thing that our audience are going to be driven insane by once you realise it as well. So Mork and Mindy, they first appeared in Happy Days, which was made in the 70s but set in the 1950s. When they made the Mork and Mindy TV show, it was set in the contemporary 70s. So how does that work from a continuity perspective with Happy Days? I don't know.
It's just one of many problems with Happy Days that we'll almost certainly come back and attempt to address in a future episode. But essentially, and this is my own language. It's not something Case said in their report, but basically,
There wasn't a long section on Mork and Mindy in the report.
no, surprisingly little about that topic. But essentially, the public view researchers a lot like Mork, as in kind of a benevolent alien creature, someone who's good at maths and knows their way around a test tube, probably very much at home in a lab, maybe even born in a test tube, like Mork famously was. They didn't survey the test tube part, but essentially someone who's very different, very kind of remote. They don't really know what researchers do or where they do it, but they assume it involves labs and test tubes and computers and a lot of statistics, weirdly enough.
I mean, that's basically my sort of clip art picture of what a science lab looks like. So I don't know, I guess like Mr. Spock would be another example of this sort of thing.
Yeah, and who knows where Spock does his science? Like, we never see it on Star Trek. I refuse to believe it happens on the bridge, because nobody is getting work done on the bridge of a starship. Like, you've got a captain there constantly doing Zoom calls on the big screen, like with audio. Like, he's not even wearing headphones when he's having his like diplomatic calls and shit. Absolute nightmare. So, like, sure, maybe you could do some science if he went off somewhere. Occasionally it's in like the med bay, because apparently science and medicine are the same thing. Most of the time it just seems to be a weird pair of binoculars stuck into a desk that he peers into. But, who am I? I'm not an expert on 23rd century science, James. But what's even more disturbing is that
the colour of the uniforms. Why are the medical people wearing the same colour as the science people and not the engineering people? Why do the engineering people, surely they're more similar to science than medicine? It doesn't make any sense.
Exactly, James. And once again, topics for a future podcast, no doubt. But what's kind of more disturbing is that only 29% of people could think of ways that R&D benefits the UK. And if they talked about their own region, that fell to 22%. And for their local area, like 18%. And as you would expect, right, those numbers are lower the more deprived the area is that you're in. So if you're in London, yeah, sure, you can see R&D happening around you, and you can maybe see some of the benefits of that a bit more visibly. If you're in, the back end of the north of England in a struggling post-industrial town, it's pretty hard to understand in practical terms, like, what is all this science stuff actually doing to improve my life, which is generally getting worse.
What's sort of astonishing about this, Martin, is that this survey, and we're talking about this now, not so long ago after the vaccine rollout, which I think was, all things considered, a pretty good example of R&D making a pretty big impact on our lives.
Yeah, it is sort of fascinating, because obviously, like, the pandemic was an incredible science event in a sense. Like, the vaccine rollout is one of the most successful R&D exercises in recent times, and yet the speed of it actually, in some respects, made people quite nervous. It almost frightened people that you could produce a vaccine in a couple of months instead of years as they were used to. And I think for all of the modern technology we have, when you actually look at the impacts on your lives, like, I would argue computers not really any better now than they were 10 years ago. I think once we got to like an iPhone, an iPad, and a MacBook Pro, like there's not really been much improvement since then. Unless you're doing really kind of high end stuff. Browsing the internet, worse than it was 10 years ago. Social media, basically a bonfire now. Used to be like a happy place you'd go and make up hashtags, and now it's full of Nazis. And, we've talked about car parking or like using public services where in theory technology can make it a lot better. In practice, it just means you've got 17 different apps on your phone and none of them work and your car gets flooded, which isn't really about the technology, but just a personal grievance of mine. Um, so it's kind of not surprising. And this comes up in some of the deep dive interviews that Case did. So once they got into a discussion with people and they started prompting them a bit more, it was easier for people to start picking out things like air fryers, for example, which are miraculous. ChatGPT, which is less miraculous, but fun, let's say. WhatsApp, which even your nan is using now, or your parents, or whatever. Streaming on TV, like these are all things people, when they're prompted, they'll say, yeah, that's quite good. I like the fact that I've got Netflix, even though it costs 18 quid a month or whatever. I like the fact that I can cook chicken in a bucket in 15 minutes or whatever. Please don't follow any recipes we give out. But crucially, they didn't actually think those things made their lives much better in terms of happiness or well-being. And there's a suggestion in there that apps are a major part of that disconnect.
So people are happy they can get, their Deliveroo or use WhatsApp, but I guess they're worried about getting too fat or that their uncle's becoming some mad conspiracy theorist because of social media or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of a sense that, okay, these technologies are convenient, but they don't make us feel good or feel better in a way. And we could do a whole other episode on this, and I'm sure we will at some point. But I think a major root cause of this is that the tech industry in the 2010s really obsessively focused and drilled down into this kind of narrow metric driven development. So they're fixating on, how engaged are people in the products? How much time are they spending on Facebook? Like how convenient is it? How many of their photos are they sharing? How many posts do they like? How quickly can they complete a task? Because those are easy things to measure and optimize and to some extent improve and juice the statistics for most of your users. But it's much harder to measure well-being or mood. Like, how do I feel when I use Facebook? Like, if I've been scrolling on my phone, but angry for the most part.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Incredibly angry. But if you're scrolling your phone, like, it's easy to measure, like, how many reels do people scroll through. But how do they feel when they wake up and they've spent half an hour going through random clips of influencers and God knows what? It doesn't necessarily make them feel better or that they've achieved anything with their day. And in a weird way, it's like the tech industry is a bit like other industries were in the 1950s, where it would just be like, you'd see an advert on TV that would like, hey, try new fruit haze. It's 97% sugar and full of lithium. You'll be cheerful for days. And it's like, yeah, that's great. And everyone would have it and stuff their faces with it. And then 5 days later, they'd be falling dead in the street of heart attacks. I'm not sure that's literally what happened, but metaphorically, that's what the 50s was like. People were sold stuff by unscrupulous advertisers. They ate it until they passed out in the streets and died. And that's sort of where the tech industry is now. It's basically like junk food in the 60s. Like, it understands like that it can sell products, but it doesn't really have any concepts of the impact that it's having or the long-term harms that are created.
So do you think we'll look back like we do on the 50s now? You get these weird like 50s adverts and it's like, here's a fridge or something and it's full of asbestos and radium or something. In 50 years, are we going to look back on Facebook today and go, what were we all smoking?
I mean, yeah, almost literally. I wonder about like doctors that went on Twitter and like encouraged people to use Twitter. Doctors in like 2080 going to look back at that and say, man, this was like those ones in the 50s that said you should have a cigarette a day to keep the doctor away. Like, what were they doing bringing people onto social media? That's mad. Now we know that it rots your brain and takes 30 points off your IQ. But like, surely they must have realized at the time, James.
So Martin, I guess what you're saying is this all feeds into people thinking that technology is moving too fast and that's what's driving that sort of fear.
Well, you'd think so, but it turns out that people are basically impossible. And so people simultaneously think that technology is moving too fast, but also that it's moving too slow. So hydrogen boilers, for example, or they didn't mention it specifically, but I would imagine things like electric car infrastructure. There's a perception that, oh, we've been promised these things for years now. Where are they? Why aren't a lot of these things getting any better? And I think a lot of this comes back to a complaint that I've often had about human beings, which is that we're really, really bad at understanding the difference between big numbers and small numbers, and like what is big or expensive, what is small or cheap. We've talked before about £1 billion, for example. £1 billion is a rounding error for the NHS budget. When Captain Tom was doing his lengths up and down the garden in support of supposedly the NHS, in reality a charity adjacent to the NHS, and then ultimately a whole other charity that we're not going to go into on this podcast for legal reasons, but involved a very nice spa that got demolished. This kind of stuff, the money raised is absolutely negligible. It is nothing in the context of the NHS. And I think there's something similar with some of these technologies. Like, it's almost like people have their own perception of how hard are different things, but actually they don't really match up with reality that well. So people, as I mentioned, were very nervous about the speed of the vaccine rollout, because in people's minds, medical research takes like 10 years or 5 years. Like, the idea you could just wake up tomorrow and be like, on Star Trek, hey, I've done some numbers on Mr. Spock's little binocular machine, and suddenly we've got a vaccine in the space of one episode. Like, if that happened in real life, the Enterprise crew would not be lining up to take the vaccine. They'd be sitting there going, what the fuck, Spock? This doesn't seem legitimate. Have you even done a peer-reviewed, like, Cochrane gold standard clinical trial? Like, what do? You think I'm going to jab that thing in my arm? You're not even human. There'd be just fear and mistrust and loathing, and the whole crew would fall apart. So you're battling against people's existing conceptions. But then on the other hand, if they look at something like hydrogen boilers, why is that going to take so long? It's just a boiler. Like, you sell boilers every day. Like, what's the issue? So there's sort of an underestimation of the complexity of other things. Like, why can't I just deploy a massive wind farm in the North Sea? Like, why is it so difficult? And I think that's the thing. Like, people's perceptions are just somewhat out of whack with these abstract things that are happening.
I'm going to derail slightly, Martin. What is a hydrogen boiler? I'd never heard of a hydrogen boiler until you started using the word hydrogen boiler. I'm familiar with a heat pump and like a normal boiler, whatever that would be called.
It's sort of a computer. We're going to get calls in if I try and explain it now off the cuff. But essentially, it's an alternative to heat pumps. Basically, the idea is, instead of using gas boilers, why don't we just use ones where hydrogen is the gas? Apparently, it's all very safe now. It sounds a tiny bit explosive, but I'm really only saying that to goad people who know more than me into rising into the podcast and explaining them better. And actually, it's kind of surprising that it came up in the report, because I'm not sure how many members of the public, unprompted, would have randomly talked about hydrogen boilers. But stranger things have happened.
So I'm going to go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole in a bit, looking at hydrogen boilers, I think. Anyway,
no.
Martin, so this all sounds very negative from what you're saying. The public, they sound sort of cynical and miserable. Are there any positives to this research? Do people still like research? Surely people still see, in principle, it being quite a good thing.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the most interesting findings was about failure. And again, this is one of those times when I think, as much as we joke about it, I generally believe in public opinion. I think the public, even if they don't know exactly what they want, generally they're vibing in the right kind of direction. And the public...
We might disagree here, Martin.
Well, I think, you can look at, like, let's say, obviously you and I were on the Remain side of the Brexit vote, but I can also understand from a public perception that, like, things are going in the wrong direction. We've been given an opportunity to roll the dice and do a course correction, and I kind of get that. In the same sense, I get them not voting for Jeremy Corbyn and then also wanting to chuck out Rishi Sunak kind of later on. Like, the public, generally speaking, they're not always correct. But like I said, and this is a phrase I'm going to stick to, they're vibing in the right direction. Don't try and interrogate it. None of us know what that means. So I think an example of this is, like, the public are often much more sophisticated about topics than politicians and the media give them credit for. So we talked about immigration at the start of this episode. Another area I think that comes up is the concept and the importance of failure in doing things like research. So over half of the public accepts that failure is a vital part of R&D. So they think we should invest in R&D, and they also understand that some of those investments won't work. And I think that's fascinating in the context of a media environment where if any government agency does anything and it costs like, I don't know, £2 million or something, the papers will be charging in going, but you've wasted money. You did this thing and it didn't work the way you wanted it to. What a waste. And actually, the public are much more sophisticated than that. They understand that if you try things, some of them are going to not work. And they're totally chill about that, which is fantastic. They're also skeptical, like they understand that the private sector is a bit more agile and this moves in, tends to own a lot more R&D. They seem to almost overestimate the amount of R&D that the private sector does, but they're keen for the government to focus on it. Like they do see it as a public good and they see it as a risk that is worth taking, which I think is a really healthy attitude.
God, maybe you are persuading me they are vibing in the right direction because, yeah, I agree with you entirely on the risk thing. It does infuriate me how the entire lobby correspondent mindset is to try and sort of poke holes. It would be a lot better if we could have a culture, certainly in politics and in Westminster, where failure was understood in context. As we tried this thing, it didn't work. The DWP, they tried a bunch of AI stuff not so long ago, and it didn't work. And it was a good test. It was a good trial to see what could happen. But then, obviously, a lot of the sort of the reporting on it was, well, they tried this thing and it failed and therefore it's bad, rather than they tried this thing, it didn't work, we'll try something else.
Yeah, it's this constant like gotcha culture. It's not big, it's not clever, it's profoundly stupid, in fact, and it doesn't really educate anyone about what's going on. And so I think it's really heartening to see that the public don't really fall into that trap. And actually, there's some real ambition there, right? So half of people want Britain to be a world leader in R&D, which again, I think just shows how disastrous a lot of recent decisions have been. So whether it's the crackdown on visas for research, which again have broad support across the population, even among reform voters, for example, the recent handling of life sciences in the UK, where we are a world leading power in life science, but we have companies like AstraZeneca that are struggling to make much progress in the UK because of the various differences and frankly slowness of the government in working with them. And people want to see R&D facilities built in their local area. They recognize it's going to boost the local economy. Above all, though, they want to hear more about what's happening. And I think that's maybe where some of the disconnect is as well. And I think people's perceptions of R&D are still very narrow. They still associate it with scientists, labs, test tubes. They don't tend to think as much about R&D in the context of computer games, for example, or culture or cinema. Like huge amounts of R&D happens in filmmaking or television. The legal system, law, anywhere where you're researching new ways to do something is R&D, but we're not very good at explaining that to the public across society. And so the more that we can do that, and the more that we can show them that interesting things are happening and they're happening in their area and they're making things better, the better it's going to be and the more abundance we're going to have in the future. They just really want to hear more from people, even businesses.
And presumably as well from podcasters, Martin. I hope so.
Well, this is slightly awkward, James, because apparently there are two groups of people that the public does not want to hear about R&D from. One of them, I think you could probably guess, James, is...
Surely politicians or something, or estate agents.
Yeah, politicians. I mean, politicians are right at the top of the list of people who should probably just stay quiet, other than here's some money. And then social media influencers and specifically podcasters. Apparently, 62% of the public think, James, that we personally are untrustworthy.
This is devastating. My entire self-worth is being denigrated. So I guess if you want to try and keep that up to keep me doing this podcast, please like and subscribe to this show, or make sure you're subscribed in your podcast app. Tell your friends about the show, because apparently we need your help because nobody trusts us.
Yeah, and we'll try not to lie too blatantly. In fact, for every new subscriber, we promise to correct one falsehood that we propagated in a previous episode. How about that?
Yeah, we'll try and cut down on the false information. So yeah, now let's move on to something else. Next up, we've got an interview with the Pope.